Brit, you've never met a man my size. Let me show you how it's done," the lone cowboy whispered to the widow. The sun hung low in the sky, painting the horizon with shades of orange and gold. Brit, dust swirled along the dirt road, lifted by a gentle breeze that whispered through the wooden fences of the small town.
It was the kind of town that seemed almost forgotten by time.
Brit, a few wooden houses lined the main street, their paint faded from years of sun and wind. The general store's sign swung slowly, creaking as it caught the breeze. Brit. Chickens clucked and wandered near the edge of the street, and a horse whinnied softly somewhere behind a barn. Into this quiet, sleepy town rode a man unlike any the townsfolk had seen before. Brit. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with a quiet confidence that made people take notice without even trying. His horse, a strong chestnut with a shiny coat, moved with steady steps, its hooves kicking up small clouds of dust. Brit. The man wore a wide-brimmed hat that cast a shadow over his face, but his sharp eyes still seemed to look straight through anyone who tried to meet them. There was something different about him, something that made the town feel smaller the moment he appeared. He stopped near the center of the town, letting his horse catch its breath. The cowboy ran his hand along the leather of the saddle, adjusting it carefully before looking around. There was a calmness to him, a sense that he had ridden many miles and seen many things that others could not imagine. People peeked out from behind windows, their curiosity piqued by the newcomer. Brit. Some whispered to each other, "Who is he? And where did he come from?" The whispers carried down the dusty street, but no one dared approach him just yet. The cowboy guided his horse slowly toward the general store, the creak of the wooden wheels of his saddle echoing softly. Brit. The store was modest, but it had everything a small town needed: sacks of flour, cans of food, nails, rope, and a few trinkets. Behind the counter stood a woman who seemed to have grown older overnight, though she was only in her late 30s. Brit. Her hair, once dark and lively, was streaked with gray, and her eyes carried the quiet sadness of someone who had lost too much. She was the widow of a man who had passed not long ago, leaving her to manage both the store and the small home attached to it. Brit. She noticed the cowboy before he spoke. There was something about his presence that was hard to ignore. Brit. He tipped his hat slightly, a polite gesture that felt both old-fashioned and respectful. "Afternoon," he said, his voice low but warm, like a soft rumble. Brit. "I'm just passing through. Thought I'd see what the town has to offer." Brit. The widow studied him carefully. "Afternoon," she replied cautiously. Brit. Her voice was firm, though there was a hint of curiosity. She had learned not to trust strangers easily, but there was nothing threatening about him. Brit. His eyes, a clear shade of blue, held a calm honesty. He tied his horse near the hitching post outside and glanced around, taking in the details of the town. Brit. The buildings were simple but sturdy, and the townspeople, though few, carried themselves with the quiet pride of people who worked hard and relied on each other. The cowboy's gaze returned to the widow, and he smiled faintly. Brit. It was not a wide grin, but enough to show a hint of warmth. "I hear you run this place alone?" he asked, leaning slightly against the doorway. Brit. "Yes," she said, keeping her tone neutral. "Since my husband passed, it's just been me." There was a pause, and then she added, almost under her breath, "It's not easy, but I manage." Brit. He could sense the weight of responsibility she carried, the invisible load she bore every day just to keep the store open and make ends meet. Brit. "I can't imagine," he said quietly. "Must be hard." Brit. "It is," she admitted. "But life doesn't stop for anyone." Brit. "You do what you have to do." He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The wooden floorboards creaked under his boots, and the faint smell of dust, dried herbs, and old wood filled the air. He moved slowly, looking at the shelves and the items neatly arranged, though his attention often returned to the widow. There was an ease in his movements, a quiet grace, and he seemed to take in every detail without rushing.
"I like how you keep things organized," he said.
Not many people take the time to do that anymore. The widow blinked at the compliment, slightly surprised. "Thank you," she said. "I suppose it's a habit." She hesitated, then asked, "Are you planning to stay in town?" The cowboy shook his head. "Not long." "Just long enough to rest, maybe trade some goods, and move on." But he paused, glancing at the sacks of supplies near the counter.
"If you don't mind, I could lend a hand for a bit. It looks like a lot of work for one person." The widow raised an eyebrow, a faint smile tugging at her lips.
She wasn't used to strangers offering help without expecting anything in return.
"You'd do that?"
she asked, curious but cautious.
He nodded, tipping his hat slightly. "I'm handy with my hands," he said.
"And I know my way around a store like this. Might even make things a bit easier for you." There was a moment of silence, the kind that feels heavy with unspoken thoughts.
The widow considered his offer, weighing her pride against the relief of having an extra pair of strong hands. Finally, she nodded. "All right," she said. "If you don't mind." The cowboy smiled faintly and moved toward the sacks of supplies. He lifted one with ease, his strength evident but not showy. He placed it gently on the counter, careful not to damage anything. The widow watched him, noting the way his muscles moved under his shirt, the careful way he treated the items, and the quiet confidence that seemed to follow him everywhere. "Phew. You've never met a man my size," he said quietly, almost as if to himself. "Let me show you how it's done." The widow laughed softly, surprised by the gentle humor in his voice. It was the first genuine smile she had shown in weeks. There was something comforting about him, something that made the day feel a little brighter despite the hard work and the lingering grief she carried. Over the next few hours, the cowboy helped the widow organize the shelves, stock the items, and even fix a small broken counter with some tools he carried. He worked quietly, speaking only when necessary, and always with respect. The townspeople peeked in occasionally, watching the newcomer and the widow. Whispers traveled down the street again, but this time with admiration and curiosity rather than suspicion. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the town, the work was done. The store looked neat and inviting, and the widow felt a sense of relief she hadn't felt in months. The cowboy leaned against the doorframe, looking out at the fading light, his hat casting a shadow over his face. "You did well today," the widow said, her voice soft but sincere. "Thank you." He nodded, tipping his hat once more. "It was my pleasure." "It was my pleasure." Sometimes helping someone makes the day a little lighter for both of us."
As he walked back to his horse, the widow felt a strange mix of emotions, curiosity, relief, and a quiet spark of hope.
There was something different about this man, something that set him apart from everyone else she had met. She didn't know how long he would stay in town, or what his story was, but she felt certain that his presence would leave a mark, one she would not forget any time soon. The cowboy mounted his horse, looking once more at the small town bathed in twilight. With a gentle nudge to the horse, he began to ride slowly down the dusty road, disappearing into the horizon where the sun had just set. But even as he left, the memory of his presence lingered in the store, in the hearts of those who had seen him, and especially in the widow's mind. For the first time in a long while, she felt that life might just have a little room for hope, and perhaps even for companionship, if only she dared to open her heart again. The next morning, the town awoke to the soft light of a new day. The sun rose slowly, casting golden rays over the rooftops and lighting up the dusty streets. Birds chirped from the trees near the edge of the town, and a faint wind carried the scent of fresh hay from the nearby stables. The general store's wooden sign swayed gently, creaking in rhythm with the wind, announcing that business had begun for another day. Inside the store, the widow moved about with quiet efficiency. Brit. She was arranging jars of honey on a shelf, checking cans for dust, and straightening boxes that had been shifted overnight. Her hands worked automatically, but her mind wandered back to the cowboy from the day before. There was something about the way he had carried himself, the careful way he treated each item, and the quiet strength he possessed that lingered in her thoughts. She shook her head slightly, telling herself not to dwell on a stranger. Brit. After all, he had said he was only passing through. The sound of hooves on the street made her look up. Through the window she saw him approaching again, riding the same chestnut horse that seemed as calm and strong as its rider. He tipped his hat when their eyes met, and she felt a small smile tug at her lips. Brit. This time, he dismounted a little further from the store, allowing the horse to graze while he walked toward the door. Brit.
Good morning, he said, his voice calm and steady. I hope I'm not intruding. Good morning, she replied, trying to keep her voice neutral.
Brit. Not at all. I wasn't expecting anyone so early. I like early mornings, he said, glancing around the quiet street. Brit. There's something peaceful about them. Less noise, less rush. Brit.
Just enough time to think. She nodded, finding herself listening more than she expected.
Brit. There was honesty in his words that made her relax a little. I suppose so, she said. Brit. It's also the best time to get work done before the heat sets in. He stepped inside, the floorboards creaking softly beneath his boots. He looked around at the neatly arranged shelves, at the jars and boxes, the little details that spoke of care and effort. You've done a fine job keeping this place in order, he said. It's clear someone here takes pride in their work. The widow felt a warmth in her chest at the compliment. People in town sometimes noticed her work, but few ever commented on it with sincerity.
Thank you, she replied quietly.
Brit. I try my best. He smiled faintly, as if sharing a small secret. Brit. That effort shows in every little thing. It doesn't go unnoticed. Brit. She looked at him more closely. There was a gentleness in his eyes, a patience that seemed rare in these parts. Brit. And yet, there was also a strength, the kind that made it clear he had faced hardships and challenges many could not imagine. For a moment she allowed herself to forget her usual caution and simply watch him work. Brit. I could help again today, he said, nodding toward a stack of boxes near the back of the store. If you don't mind. Her first instinct was to refuse. Brit. Pride had always been her shield, and she had managed alone for months without complaint. But she hesitated, remembering the ease with which he had handled the work the day before. Brit. And, truthfully, a small part of her welcomed the help. Brit. All right, she said finally, if you don't mind. He moved to the boxes without hesitation, lifting them with surprising ease. Brit. His movements were smooth and confident, yet careful. He didn't rush, didn't force, and didn't make a show of his strength. The widow found herself watching the way his arms flexed, the way his hands adjusted the boxes, and even the way his eyes scanned the shelves as if planning the best order. You seem, Brit, careful with everything you do, she remarked, almost to herself.
He glanced at her, a faint smile playing on his lips.
Brit. I've learned that rushing or being careless only creates more work later. It's better to take your time and do it right the first time.
She nodded, feeling a sense of understanding between them.
Britt, there was something reassuring in his presence, a steadiness that made her feel less alone in the quiet, dusty town. As they worked together, conversation began to flow more naturally. The widow found herself sharing small stories about the town, her late husband, and the routines she maintained to keep the store running. The cowboy listened patiently, occasionally offering a small comment or question that encouraged her to continue. Britt. He never pried or interrupted, but his interest was clear. "You've been through a lot," he said quietly at one point, his voice carrying genuine respect. "Britt, it's not easy to keep going after losing someone." She looked down at her hands, momentarily unsure how to respond. "No, it's not," she admitted. "Britt, but life doesn't stop. You learn to carry the weight and keep moving forward." He nodded, understanding without judgment. "Britt, I know something about carrying weight," he said softly. "Not always the kind you can see." The widow looked up at him, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "Britt, you've lost someone too?" she asked gently. He hesitated, then shook his head slightly. "Britt, not exactly," he said, "but I've lost more than I can count." Britt. "Friends, family, chances to start over. You get used to walking alone." Britt, For a moment the store was quiet, except for the soft sounds of movement. The shifting of boxes, the creaking floorboards, the faint rustle of wind outside. She realized that, even in this brief conversation, a connection was forming. Britt. He was not just a stranger passing through. He was someone who understood in some way the weight of life and the quiet struggles that accompanied it. As the morning passed, the widow noticed something else about him. Britt. Despite his imposing size and strong frame, there was a gentleness in his touch, a patience in his actions, and a kindness in his eyes. He spoke softly, laughed quietly at small jokes, and never demanded attention. Britt.
It was a rare combination, and it intrigued her. At one point, a customer entered the store, a young man from the town looking for tools.
Britt. The widow stepped forward to assist him, and the cowboy moved to the side, observing silently. The young man struggled to find the right tool, and the widow tried to explain, but the cowboy stepped forward gently. Britt. "This one should work," he said, holding up the correct tool. "It's sturdy and reliable." Britt. "You'll have no trouble with it." The young man looked up at him in surprise, clearly impressed by the cowboy's knowledge.
"Thank you, sir," he said, taking the tool with a smile.
Britt. The widow watched the interaction, noting how people responded to him. There was a natural respect he commanded, not through fear or force, but simply through the way he carried himself and treated others. Britt. She felt a small sense of relief knowing he was in town, even if only for a short while. By midday, the work in the store was nearly complete. Britt. Shelves were organized, boxes were stored neatly, and the floor was swept clean. The widow felt lighter than she had in weeks, not just because of the physical help, but because of the quiet companionship he had offered. Britt.
"You've made this easier than I expected," she said, a small smile appearing. "Thank you."
Britt.
I told you I know how to handle my size,
he said with a soft laugh. "But it's more than just strength."
Britt. "It's about paying attention and doing things carefully. Anyone can lift a box, but not everyone can make sure it's done right." Britt. "Bye." She laughed softly, feeling a warmth in her chest. "I suppose that's true," she said. Britt. For a moment they stood in comfortable silence, looking around the store. Outside, the town continued its quiet rhythm, the occasional wagon creaking down the street, a dog barking in the distance, the sun climbing higher into the sky. Inside, there was a sense of peace, a feeling that for the first time in a long while the widow was not alone in her work or in her thoughts. The cowboy finally moved toward the door, preparing to leave. Britt. He looked back at her and said quietly, "I'll be around if you need help again. You don't have to face everything alone." Britt. Bow. She nodded, feeling a strange mixture of gratitude and curiosity. "I appreciate that," she said softly. Britt. As he mounted his horse and rode slowly down the street, the widow watched him disappear into the distance, feeling a sense of anticipation she hadn't felt in years. She did not know how long he would stay in town, what his story truly was, or why he had chosen to offer his help, but she felt certain that his presence would continue to ripple through her life, bringing a quiet sense of hope, connection, and perhaps even the promise of something new. The rest of the day passed with a renewed energy. Britt. The widow worked with lighter steps and a more cheerful heart. The memory of the cowboy's quiet strength and thoughtful words lingered, giving her the courage to face the challenges ahead. And though she did not know it yet, this was only the beginning of a bond that would grow stronger with each passing day, built on respect, understanding, and the shared experience of carrying life's burdens together. Rest. The days passed slowly in the small town, but the rhythm of life was changing for both the widow and the cowboy. The sun rose and set over dusty streets, carrying with it the ordinary sounds of daily work, the clatter of horse hooves, the creak of wagon wheels, the faint ringing of the bell above the general store door as townsfolk came and went. Britt. Yet behind the quiet routine, a tension was beginning to grow, a tension that neither the widow nor the cowboy could ignore. It started with small signs. Britt. A wagon with unfamiliar men would pass slowly down the main street, their eyes lingering too long on the widow's store. A harsh word, spoken by a distant neighbor, hinted at judgment for a woman trying to manage on her own. Britt. And then, one morning, the widow discovered a letter slipped under her door, written in a rough hand. It warned her to sell the store and leave town, or face consequences. Britt. Her heart sank as she held the paper in her hands, her fingers trembling slightly. She knew she could not face this alone. But when she thought of asking for help, her mind went to the cowboy. He was not just a strong man. He had proven himself reliable, careful, and kind. Britt. Yet she hesitated. She was proud, and pride had always been her shield. Britt. Could she ask a stranger to stand with her against those who threatened her home and livelihood? Meanwhile, the cowboy had sensed the unease in the town. Britt. He noticed the wary looks of the townsfolk and the whispered conversations as he walked down the street. Something was wrong, though the town tried to hide it behind polite smiles. Britt.
He had faced threats before, seen the dangerous side of human nature, and he knew when trouble was near.
Britt. He could see it in the way the widow's eyes darted to shadows, in the tense stiffness of her shoulders, in the way she carried herself as if bracing for an attack. Finally, one evening, he approached her quietly in the store as she stacked the last few cans on the top shelf. Britt. Something's wrong, he said softly, his eyes steady and calm. I can feel it. Britt. You don't have to face it alone. The widow sighed and shook her head, trying to keep her fear hidden. I don't know if I should involve you, she admitted. Britt. You came here to rest, not to get caught up in my problems. He smiled faintly, though his eyes did not waver. Rest doesn't mean running from what needs to be done, he said. Britt.
If someone is threatening you, I'm not going to stand by and watch. I may be passing through, but I can still help.
Britt. Bo. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she considered his words. There was truth in them, and a sense of relief she had not allowed herself to feel. Britt. Finally she nodded. All right, she said quietly. I suppose I don't have a choice. They won't leave me alone, and I can't face it on my own. He nodded, a calm resolve settling over him. Britt. Then we face it together. The next day, the cowboy began to prepare. He walked the streets, observing the town and the surrounding area.
He spoke with the sheriff, a quiet man who had always been fair but limited in his ability to handle trouble. "There are men coming," the cowboy said plainly.
I've seen signs. You need to be ready, and so does the widow. The sheriff frowned, rubbing the back of his neck. You may be right, he said. We've had rumors of outsiders trying to claim land and businesses. It's rare in this town, but it does happen. The widow, meanwhile, prepared herself in her own way. She reinforced the windows and doors, gathered supplies, and made sure the store was secure. She watched the cowboy work with a sense of admiration. His strength was not just in his size, but in his planning and careful thought. He treated the town and its people with respect, and yet he moved like someone who could take action in an instant if needed. Then, the first confrontation arrived. It was a hot afternoon when a group of men unfamiliar to the town rode into the street. Their faces were hard, their voices rough, and they made no effort to hide their intent. They stopped outside the widow's store, dismounting and stepping forward.
"Sell the store!" one of them demanded. "It doesn't belong to you anymore!"
Your husband's family wants it, and we're here to make sure you leave.
The widow's hands shook slightly, but she straightened her shoulders. "This store belongs to me," she said firmly.
You have no right to demand anything. The men laughed, a sound that grated against the quiet of the town. We'll see about that, another said. The cowboy stepped forward, placing himself between the widow and the men. His broad frame seemed to fill the space, and his eyes held a calm, unyielding focus. I think you should leave, he said quietly, though his voice carried a weight that demanded attention. There's no need for trouble.
Go back the way you came. The men sneered at him, sizing him up. And who are you? One of them asked.
Some stranger trying to play hero. The cowboy's gaze did not waver.
I'm someone who won't let you harm her, he said.
His calm tone made it clear that this was not a request but a warning. The tension in the street was thick. The townsfolk peeked from behind windows, unsure if they should intervene or stay hidden. The widow's heart pounded in her chest, a mix of fear and awe. She had never seen someone so confident and steady in the face of danger. A standoff began. The men circled slightly, looking for an opening, while the cowboy remained still, ready for anything. Time seemed to stretch as the sun beat down, the heat making the silence almost unbearable. Then, slowly, the men realized that the cowboy's calm was not weakness. It was strength. He did not need to shout or brandish a weapon to command respect. Desperate. His presence alone was enough to make them hesitate. Finally, one of the men muttered a curse under his breath, and they mounted their horses. Without another word, they rode off, leaving the street and the widow's store untouched. The cowboy watched them go, his gaze never leaving their backs until they disappeared beyond the horizon. The widow let out a long breath she hadn't realized she had been holding.
"Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling.
He nodded, not with pride, but with quiet reassurance. It's not over, he said softly. But we've bought ourselves time. We'll need to be ready if they come back. In the days that followed, the cowboy helped the widow prepare for any further threats. They reinforced the store, learned about the surrounding land, and even devised simple strategies to protect themselves. The widow began to trust him not just for his strength, but for his wisdom and careful planning. He never pushed her beyond what she was comfortable with, and he always made sure she felt safe. Through it all, their connection deepened. There were small moments, shared cups of tea in the morning, quiet conversations about life and loss, and a mutual respect that grew stronger with each passing day. The cowboy began to reveal small pieces of his own story, speaking of journeys he had taken, the people he had known, and the lessons he had learned. The widow listened, feeling a sense of kinship she had not expected. Yet, despite the growing trust, both knew the tension was far from gone. The threat lingered like a shadow over the town, reminding them that peace was fragile and that danger could return at any moment. But they also realized that together, they were stronger than they had been alone. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned a soft orange, the widow watched the cowboy repair a fence near the edge of her property. His movements were deliberate, strong, and calm. She realized that the fear she had carried for months had begun to fade, replaced by a cautious hope. For the first time since her husband's passing, she felt that someone truly had her back, not just in words, but in action. The cowboy looked up, catching her gaze. "We'll get through this," he said simply, a quiet determination in his eyes. "One step at a time, and we'll make sure you're safe." It was trust, respect, and the beginning of something she did not fully understand yet, but something she was willing to explore. As night fell, the town settled into quiet again, but the bond between the widow and the cowboy had strengthened. The challenges were not over, and the days ahead promised more tension and uncertainty. But for the first time in a long while, she did not feel alone. And he, though still a wanderer at heart, had found a reason to stay close, even if only for a little while. In that quiet moment, beneath the wide-open sky and the faint stars beginning to appear, both understood that life could still bring connection, hope, and strength, even in the face of threat.
And together, they would face whatever came next.
The days that followed were tense, even when the sun shone bright and the wind carried a peaceful warmth through the town. The widow and the cowboy had settled into a rhythm of careful preparation. Each morning, they checked the locks, reinforced the windows, and planned for the possibility that the men who had threatened the store might return. Life felt different now, heavier, and yet, in its own way, alive. They were both learning to rely on each other. And even though the widow would not admit it out loud, she found comfort in the cowboy's presence. But calm was fleeting. One hot afternoon, the tension they had been trying to ignore came crashing down in the form of hoofbeats pounding the street outside. The widow froze, glancing at the dusty road as a group of riders appeared over the horizon. They were the same men from before, their faces set with a determination and anger. The leader waved a piece of paper in the air, making their intentions clear. They were coming to take the store, no matter what. The widow's heart pounded as she turned to the cowboy. "They're back," she said, her voice trembling. He nodded, his face serious, but calm. "We've prepared for this," he said softly. "Stay inside. I'll handle it." She hesitated. "Be careful," she whispered. "I don't want you hurt." He gave her a small smile, gentle but firm. "I'll be all right." "Trust me." The men rode up the street, their horses kicking up dust and their eyes fixed on the store. The cowboy stepped forward to meet them, standing tall and steady in the middle of the street. The widow watched from the doorway, her hands gripping the wooden frame, her breath shallow. Fear and worry pressed against her chest, but she also felt a strange pride in the way he faced the danger. "Leave now," the cowboy said, his voice calm but firm.
"There's no reason for trouble. The leader laughed, a harsh, grating sound that made the widow flinch. "We're not leaving," he said.
"This store belongs to someone else now. Step aside, stranger, or face the consequences." The cowboy's eyes did not leave the man's face, Britt.
"I said leave," he repeated. "I'm not asking."
The tension stretched for what felt like hours, though it was only minutes. Britt. The townsfolk peeked from windows, whispering anxiously. Some wanted to intervene, but fear held them back. Britt. The widow felt her heart pounding, unsure if she should run or stay. She wanted to help, to be brave, but the reality of the situation made her feel small and helpless, desperate. Suddenly, one of the men made a move toward the store. In an instant, the cowboy acted. Britt. He stepped in front of the man, his posture solid and unyielding. The air seemed to thicken with the weight of his presence. That, Britt.
The man hesitated, unsure of the cowboy's next move. The widow held her breath, every nerve on edge.
Britt. A struggle broke out, brief but intense. The cowboy moved with a skill and strength that was both precise and controlled. Britt. It did not strike with anger, but with the calm determination of someone protecting what mattered most. The men realized that brute force alone would not succeed. Britt. The cowboy's size and strength were not the only things they faced. His courage and steady focus made him a formidable opponent. Despite his skill, the cowboy was not invincible. Britt. One of the men lunged suddenly, catching him off guard. He stumbled slightly, and the widow gasped, fear tearing through her chest. Britt. He steadied himself quickly, though, and redirected his focus, protecting both himself and the widow. His broad shoulders absorbed the impact, his arms moving with careful precision to block and redirect. The leader's horse kicked, and dust filled the air. The widow ducked inside, her hands pressed over her mouth as she watched from the doorway. Britt. She felt helpless, her mind racing with worry. For the first time she realized how fragile life could be, and how quickly everything could change. The struggle continued, tension thick in every movement. The cowboy's eyes never left the widow, and he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod toward her, signaling that she should stay safe. Britt. She obeyed, but her heart was aching with fear for him. Britt. She had begun to realize that he was not just strong or capable. He was someone who would protect her at any cost, even if it meant risking himself. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was only moments, the men realized that they could not win. Their harsh words faded into grumbles of frustration. The cowboy stood his ground, steady and calm, though sweat glistened on his brow and dust clung to his clothing. Britt. His chest rose and fell with measured breaths, showing his exhaustion but also his resolve. One by one, the men mounted their horses and rode away, grumbling, defeated by the calm strength they had underestimated. The town fell silent again, the only sound the soft clatter of hooves fading into the distance. The widow ran to the cowboy, fear and relief mingling in her voice. Britt. Are you all right? She asked, her hands trembling as she reached for him. He nodded, brushing dust from his coat. Britt. I'm fine, he said, his voice steady. Nothing broken, nothing serious. Britt. But it's not over yet. We'll have to stay alert. Britt. She looked at him, seeing both his strength and his vulnerability. For the first time she realized how much she had come to rely on him, not just for protection, but for comfort and reassurance. Britt. She felt a deep gratitude that went beyond words. They spent the evening checking the store again, ensuring everything was secure and safe. Britt. The widow worked alongside the cowboy, her movements deliberate and careful. She had learned from him how to pay attention to the small details, how to prepare without panic, and how to stay calm in the face of fear. Britt. The bond between them grew stronger with each shared task, each quiet word, each moment of trust. As night fell and the town grew quiet, they sat together on the porch of the store. The stars were bright, scattered across the wide, open sky like tiny lanterns. The cowboy leaned back slightly, his hat tilted to shade his eyes, and the widow sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap. "You were amazing today," she said softly, her voice full of sincerity. "I don't know what I would have done without you." He looked at her, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I did what needed to be done," he said quietly.
That's all.
"I'm glad I could help." She hesitated, then spoke again. "It's more than that. You didn't just protect the store. You protected me." He shook his head. "You don't need to thank me," he said, desperate.
Just promise me you'll stay careful. And remember, you're not alone anymore. You don't have to face everything by yourself.
The widow nodded, feeling a warmth she had not felt in years. "I promise," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I won't forget." For the first time since the threats began, a sense of peace settled over them. The danger had tested their strength and courage, but it had also brought them closer together. They had faced fear and uncertainty, and though the challenges were not fully over, they had proven to themselves that they could overcome them together. As the night deepened and the stars shone brighter, the widow felt a quiet sense of hope. She realized that life could still hold moments of trust, connection, and even joy, even after loss and fear. And she knew that, with the cowboy by her side, she could face whatever came next. The cowboy, too, felt something shift within him. He had wandered for years, carrying his past alone, avoiding connections to keep himself safe. But now he had found someone he wanted to protect, someone who trusted him and valued his presence. It was a new feeling, one that surprised him, but one he could not ignore. Together they watched the stars, the quiet night wrapping around them like a protective blanket. The town was still, the danger gone for now, and for the first time in a long while, both felt a sense of calm and belonging. The future was uncertain, the challenges not fully behind them, but in that moment they had each other. And sometimes that was enough. The morning sun rose slowly over the small town, its golden rays spilling across the dusty streets and lighting up the rooftops with a warm glow. The town, once tense and quiet, seemed to breathe again, as if the air itself had been cleared after the storm of the past days. The widow stood at the window of her store, watching the sun climb higher, feeling a sense of calm she had not felt in months. The events of the past weeks had changed everything. Her fears, her trust, and even her understanding of what life could still offer. The cowboy was already outside, tending to his horse near the hitching post. He moved with quiet care, brushing the animal's coat, checking the saddle, and making sure everything was in order. The widow stepped outside, feeling the cool morning breeze on her face, and walked toward him. She hesitated for a moment, unsure what to say, then finally spoke. "Good morning," she said softly. He looked up, tipping his hat with a small smile. "Morning," he replied. His voice was calm, steady, carrying the same quiet warmth that had drawn her in from the start. She watched him for a moment, noticing the way the sunlight caught his broad shoulders, the strong hands that had protected her in the store, and the steady calm in his eyes.
I wanted to thank you, she said, her voice gentle, for everything.
for helping me, protecting me, and staying when I thought I had to face everything alone.
He nodded, brushing dust from his coat.
Britt. You don't need to thank me, he said quietly. I did what was right. Britt. Besides, it wasn't just about protecting you, Britt.
You've been strong too. I couldn't do this alone either.
Britt. The widow felt a warmth in her chest. The widow felt a warmth in her chest. His words were not boastful or proud. They were honest, simple, and sincere. Britt. For the first time in a long while, she felt seen. Not just as a widow, or as a woman running a store alone, but as a person who had endured hardship and emerged stronger. Over the next few days, life in the town slowly returned to a gentle rhythm. The men who had threatened her store had not returned, and the sheriff assured her that they were unlikely to bother her again. The cowboy helped with the daily tasks, reorganizing shelves, repairing fences, and tending to small repairs around the store. But more than that, he brought a sense of calm and companionship that the widow had not realized she was missing. Their conversations grew longer, filled with shared stories, laughter, and quiet moments of reflection. The widow learned more about the cowboy's past, the journeys he had taken, the places he had seen, and the people he had met. He spoke of loss and loneliness, but also of hope and the lessons he had learned along the way. In turn, she shared memories of her late husband, of the life they had built together, and of the dreams she still held for her future. One afternoon, as they worked together to repair a broken section of fence near the edge of her property, the widow paused and looked at him.
Britt. You know, she said softly, I never expected someone like you to come into my life. And yet...
Britt. I'm glad you did. The cowboy glanced at her, his blue eyes calm and thoughtful.
Britt. Life has a way of surprising us, he said quietly. Sometimes the people we meet are exactly what we need, even if we don't realize it at first.
Britt.
I suppose that's true. As the days turned into weeks, the widow and the cowboy continued to build a life together, not out of necessity, but out of choice. He stayed because he wanted to, not because he had to.
Britt. She trusted him not just with her safety, but with her heart. Together they managed the store, tended to the land, and even helped neighbors when small problems arose. Britt. Their bond became a quiet, steady presence in the town, something that people noticed and respected. The townsfolk began to warm to the cowboy as well. But they saw the way he treated the widow with respect and kindness, how he worked hard alongside her, and how he defended the town quietly when danger appeared. Children waved to him as he passed. Neighbors smiled and greeted him, and even the sheriff would nod in approval whenever he saw him. He had become part of the town not by force or demand, but by the simple strength of his character. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky with shades of orange and pink, the widow and the cowboy sat on the porch of the store, watching the world settle into quiet. Britt. The wind carried the scent of hay and earth, and the distant sound of a horse's whinny reminded them of the life beyond the town. They did not speak at first, simply enjoying the calm, the shared presence, and the comfort of knowing that, for now, things were right. Britt. Finally, the widow spoke. Do you think we've really put the danger behind us? The cowboy looked out at the horizon, his eyes thoughtful. Britt. I think so, he said. But even if it comes back, we can handle it. Britt. We've learned to face it together. She nodded, feeling a sense of reassurance settle over her.
I never thought I'd feel safe again, she admitted quietly. Not just safe in the store, but safe in my own life.
Britt.
You've changed that for me. He turned to her, a small but sincere smile on his face.
Britt.
And you've reminded me that sometimes it's worth staying, worth caring, and worth trusting. You've changed my life too.
Britt. For a moment, they simply sat together, letting the words sink in. The past, the loss, the fear, the uncertainty was still there, but it no longer had the power to control them. They had faced danger, grief, and loneliness, and emerged stronger, not just as individuals, but together. The following weeks brought small joys. They planted a garden behind the store, growing vegetables and flowers that brightened the dusty yard. They repaired old fences, painted doors, and even organized small gatherings for the townsfolk, bringing a sense of community back to the streets that had felt quiet and tense for too long. Laughter returned to the store, mingling with the clatter of tools and the soft conversations of neighbors. Through it all, the widow and the cowboy's bond grew deeper. They learned the rhythms of each other's lives, the quiet moments when words were not needed, the small gestures that spoke volumes, and the shared understanding that came from facing challenges side by side. Their respect, trust, and care for each other became the foundation for a new beginning. One crisp morning, as the town stirred with the soft sounds of daily life, the cowboy approached the widow with a small bundle of papers. She looked at him curiously, and he explained.
I've been keeping track of the store, the land, and the accounts.
I thought, if you'd like, I can help you manage things more efficiently.
Not because you can't, but because 2 heads are better than 1.
The widow felt a wave of gratitude and warmth. I'd like that, she said simply. It means a lot to me. It was a small gesture, but it symbolized everything that had grown between them. Trust, partnership, and the willingness to face life together. They were not just surviving, they were building, planning, and sharing a future that neither had expected, but both welcomed. As the sun set that evening, casting long shadows across the town and painting the sky with shades of gold and crimson, the widow and the cowboy stood side by side at the edge of her property. The wind rustled gently through the trees, carrying the scent of earth and life, and for a moment everything felt perfect. "We've come a long way," the widow said softly.
Yes, the cowboy replied. And we're not done yet.
Life will always have challenges, but we can face them together. She looked at him, seeing not just the strong, imposing figure of the man who had come into town, but the gentle, steady, and caring soul beneath.
Together,
she repeated, a small smile forming on her lips. And in that quiet moment beneath the vast open sky and the fading light of day, both knew that their lives had been changed forever. The widow no longer felt alone, and the cowboy had found a place where he belonged, not just in a town, but in a heart that welcomed him. Life was not perfect, and there would be challenges ahead. But for the first time in years, they felt a deep sense of peace, hope, and possibility. The store was safe, the town was steady, and their bond had grown into something strong, quiet, and lasting. As the stars began to appear in the night sky, the widow and the cowboy returned to the porch, sitting together in the soft glow of lantern light. The world was calm, the town peaceful, and their hearts full. They had faced fear, danger, and loss, and emerged not just unbroken, but stronger, together, and ready for whatever life might bring.
And so, the small town held a new story, one of courage, trust, and quiet love. A story of a widow who had learned to hope again, and a cowboy who had found a reason to stay.
Together, they moved forward, side by side, ready to face the future with strength, patience, and the unspoken promise of always being there for each other.